Uh, Hi, everyone. If you're already here, we're going to start in about 3 minutes. So hang on until then. All right. So hi, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. As the last people are joining in, let's do a bit of introductions and housekeeping. So welcome to our webinar, Threat Exposure Management for the Expanding Attack Surface. My name is Tally. I'll be moderating this webinar. And with me are Erik Nost, who's a senior analyst at Forrester, and Marc Gaffan, who's the CEO of IONIX. To the housekeeping part, we're going to do this in a fire chat style. This means that both Marc and Erik, in the opposite order, first Erik, then Marc, will do a quick introduction, and then we'll move over to Q&A. This means that as they're talking at any time, please feel free to drop your answers, your questions into the chat, and we will address them once the introductions are finished. And with this short introduction, Erik, take it away.
Sure. Hi. Thanks so much for having me, Tally. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm Erik Nost, and I'm a senior analyst at Forrester Research. So I want to provide a little bit about what Forrester does and why I'm here. But what we do is we work with clients, all over the world, aligned to certain coverage areas. And my coverage area focuses on things like attack surface management, exposure management, vulnerability risk management. And really what you see with, all these programs is that they're expanding into a more proactive type view. So how do we think about our program and how we're managing our organization in a proactive way so that we're less reactive to threats as they focus, and we're identifying a lot of that. One of the things we also do at Forrester is we do a lot of data analysis. We conduct a lot of surveys, and I'm pretty excited to share with you some very recent survey results that we got back from our annual security and risk survey that goes out to over 3,000 security and risk leaders all over the world. And what I want to do is show you how these survey results came back, but tie it back to how you should think about your program in a proactive way, and how you can apply things like threat exposure management and so on to help improve and reduce that risk of the breach, which is one of the first questions that we actually ask. So we ask, over 3,000 security leaders, if they had a breach or not. I think this year, I guess I don't have this slide here, between 70 to 80% responded that they did have a breach. And then what we do from there was we break it down. Well, were your breaches, or was your breach the result of an external attack or an internal attack? That splits about 50-50 is how we usually see that play out. And then we take the results from, well, was it an external attack? What was the cause? What carried it out? And we increasingly see that, or we usually see that software vulnerability exploits is a primary driver here. I think 2 years ago, software vulnerability exploit was the leading cause. It was about 40% of respondents that had a breach from an external attack were due to a software vulnerability exploit. But the survey after that, we actually add in, well, was it related to like software supply chain breach? Because that's an increasing way that we see attackers breach attack services and so on. And that seems to go kind of neck to neck now, year after year, since we had that 2 years ago with software vulnerability exploits as a top external attack method. We also want to understand, what is being targeted? So where should you focus your efforts when you think about proactively managing your attack surface, and what should be within scope? So out of the respondents that said they had a breach and that there was an external attack, we get back IoT is actually the leading device that's targeted. But really what's interesting here is, if you look at the slide, is that there's such a broad range of attack surfaces here. Anything from social media accounts, cloud environments, corporate or employee-owned devices are all targets that resulted in a realized breach from respondents of this survey. So when you think about managing your attack surface and what should go into your proactive security program, this is exactly what you should consider: is everything, right? Eventually, you want to consider where and how an attacker can find it, and generally, if it's resulting in a breach for your peers, for other folks in the across the industry, it should be within your focus as well. And this is also why we see that CISO's top strategic priorities is detecting and responding to threats and increasing those capabilities. This was a new option that we put in the survey as well this year. Instantly went right to the top as far as what CISOs are focused on. And that really kind of leans into that breach. We see that breaches are increasingly common. So for us so we don't have to react to these breaches, we want to be more proactive and detect and respond to these things before they become a reality. We also ask around, what are your top challenges? So what do you want to improve within your program the most? Another new option that we added in our survey this year was, well, how are you dealing with prioritizing all these signals that you have on vulnerabilities and exposures and so on? And once again, just like that last slide, instantly shot to the top, as this is one of the top challenges that we see across organizations for wanting to have some more clarity around prioritizing just all these things that we have, because there's so much stuff that you have in your environment, and from different tools within your stack, it's hard to sometimes make sense of all this noise and properly prioritize. The last slide that we have here is, well, what are you doing after this breach, right? So are you going out and are you hiring more staff? Are you upskilling people? And time after time again, every year, we always see that the CISO budget increases post breach are real, because we see that organizations are going out and they're often spending more money. Usually, last year's survey, you see that detection technologies are what people spend the most on. This year is the first time it's actually dropped down to number 3. People are now focused more on spending technologies for protection and for incident response. So really these proactive type solutions to help manage their program and mitigate the likelihood and the impact of that breach occurring at the end of the day. So how should you think about being proactive? Well, one way we like to think about it is, are you waiting for that leak in your roof to come down, so you have to catch it in that bucket? Or are you actually, inspecting your roof? Are you looking at your structure that you live in, and the weaknesses within it, so that you're prioritizing and mitigating anything from the elements that could come outside, and ensure that you're living in a nice, warm, dry house that doesn't have leaks within it. So really, VRM analysts, they're usually they're proactive, because they're finding structural flaws before they become events, before they become a situation, which SOC analysts have to deal with often. Run around trying to catch each event, each drop of water, as they're trying to stop it from pooling on the floor and causing damage and so on. We also see threat hunters. That's another persona that's proactive. They're a little bit different than someone that's a VRM analyst, because they're finding, where the breaches already occur. There's already a pool of water on the floor, which means that they need, structural awareness to know, where should I look, what's causing it. But also applies, they also need to apply situational awareness to know, well, it's raining outside, so maybe I should go and inspect puddles and so on. So these are just some core ways to think about your proactive versus your reactive program. We do increasingly see these teams kind of melding together, and lots of value that reactive teams can learn from proactive teams, and vice versa, which is why within the Security Operations Center, we see these teams melding together over the next few years. So Tally, I think that's all I have for my intro. I hope it wasn't too long.
No, so first of all, thank you, Erik. And I think you've raised some very interesting points. I have to admit that this diagram that you have on your screen is one of the best ways to explain proactive versus reactive in a very clear way. Before we move to Marc's introduction, I do want to ask everyone in the audience to take a few seconds. This is, what are your top ASM challenges? You can select more than one. Please don't select more than 3. But just this will help us guide forward the discussion after the introduction as to, what are your challenges? And these are probably the areas that we can address in our answers later on. So Marc, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Tali. What I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes is this journey or this maturation that we're seeing in the market from, I would say, 2022 attack surface management into 2023, 2024 requirements or needs that are more now akin to managing not just the attack surface, but literally managing the threat exposure across the attack surface. And when I talk about a maturation, it's really around an evolution of the problem. So when attack surface management was coined as a category, the ultimate goal for attack surface management was help me find all the assets that I don't know about, help me bring them into scope of my security program. What we've seen, and of course the driver for all this is just the speed in which our attack surface is growing and moving. And I always say there's almost 3 vectors of change here that organizations need to cope with. One is the fact that their attack surface is just growing very, very, very quickly. So their assets they're spinning up more assets, they're decommissioning assets. So that in itself is moving. The second thing is they're making lots of changes to those assets. They're installing more software, they're doing more configuration changes, et cetera, et cetera. And the third area is the threat landscape. that's moving. So you've got these three vectors or things that are happening simultaneously that you need to get your hands around, and that's what initially attack surface management was all about, to try and bring all those assets into scope so that you can then deal with it. What we've seen is that the problem's changed now. It's not about finding the assets, it's about helping me find, so in this massive haystack that now I've become privy to, how do you help me find the critical risks that I don't know about and I need to prioritize in order to really reduce my, my threat exposure? And what that means is that organizations are moving from this visibility, which is giving you clear visibility across your attack surface. At IONIX, we tend to break out the attack surface into three areas, which we believe are operationally the right way to look at it. The inner rim or the inner circle are the assets that the organization owns and controls. Their IT is in full control there. The ring around that are the operated assets. So these are different vendors that I have. Still my assets, still my data, still my systems. They're just not operated by me, and therefore my security governance is somewhat more limited. And the third outer rim is what we call the digital supply chain. And these are all the systems and services that our systems, our vendor systems all rely on. And if they are breached or they're misconfigured, the impact could potentially be on us. But as I'm saying, we're moving, or the industry is moving from not just focusing on visibility and inventorying the attack surface, but more into focusing on what's more urgent and important. And these things could be helping me validate and find the most critical CVEs or misconfigurations that I have. These could be correlating threat intelligence with the different areas of my attack surface. This could be managing or dealing with a 0 day very, very quickly. So as soon as a 0 day is announced, I want to know where I'm potentially impacted. Where do I need to go and patch first? Companies are looking for ways to diminish or what's called attack surface reduction to help me find the assets that essentially have been forgotten, or their security posture is so bad that they always need to be decommissioned. And of course, prevent digital supply chain attacks. These could be mage cart attacks or dangling assets. This is what everyone's really focusing now, beyond just the discovery of the attack surface. And what that means is that the industry is moving from a discovery-heavy platform or requirement that does some assessment and is helping with basic areas of remediation to a much broader requirement, which is essentially the ability to discover your assets, assess them, validate what you found, because validation will help us with reducing false positives and making sure that we're chasing the problems that really exist. Putting heavy emphasis on prioritization, because everyone knows that we can't fix everything. It's about prioritizing and applying our resources where they're going to reduce their exposure in the most effective way. And the last area is remediation. How do we fit this into the organization's workflows to remediate as quickly as possible? There's one very important thing that we're seeing as a requirement when it comes to managing the attack surface or managing exposure across the attack surface, and that is how you map and build the attack surface. We believe that building the attack surface as a discrete or as a collection of discrete assets across the attack surface is just not enough, and organizations need to understand how these assets essentially are interdependent between them from a risk perspective. If one asset's compromised or one asset's been misconfigured, what does that mean for all the other assets that it could potentially be impacted? By building a topology like this, you can then also go and discover assets that are not part of your infrastructure, but they impact you. This is your digital supply chain. And the example I always like to give is if this asset here in the center is essentially your most important web application, and you've had your red team and your pen testers, and you've got a web application firewall in front of it, and you've really patched all your software, you've really done everything possible to secure that website, but you're including a third-party script that's loading a tracking cookie into it. If that tracking cookie comes from a source that potentially could be compromised, like an S3 bucket somewhere that belongs to that vendor, or maybe it's the vendors of the vendor of the vendor, if that's compromised, essentially your website's compromised because it's injecting a payload that's compromisable. And this is the view that we are that we're taking and that we believe is necessary in order to get a very complete and context-full view of the attack surface. So, Tali, I'm going to hand it over to you in terms of showing us the poll results. But I thought this was going to be a good intro to the trends that we're seeing over the last year in the transition from attack surface to more exposure or threat exposure management.
Thank you, Marc. Before we go to the poll answers, it was brought to my attention that some people did not have enough time to respond. So I'm going to bring the questions back up. If any of you did not have the time, this is the time. And I'm going to be patient for a few minutes or a few seconds before we move it forward just to see the answers. Someone going to do a countdown? Not me, right? All right, so I hope this was enough. Let's go to the answers. Interesting. That's really interesting. All right, so Marc, when you look at this, how does this compare with some of the, some of the input that you're hearing from the market or seeing?
So I'll try to address them one by one. I think that the lack of visibility or the unknowns is I would say the traditional bread and butter of ASM, of managing your attack surface. And I would say that I'll go out on a limb here and I'll say that those that mentioned this as a high priority may have not yet implemented a program around ASM, and therefore visibility is in fact their key concerns. On the flip side, I think that too many false positives or bad attribution is also something that we see a lot. And I think that as we talk about the evolution of attack surface management, we're starting to see, I would say, the rebound of the initial attack surface management purchases of solutions that have been purchased, and the level of noise being very, very high. And noise is, or false positives, I can break them into two. And it kind of relates to one here. One is, you tell me about a problem about an asset. One is, the asset doesn't even belong to me. You identified that asset wrongfully that belongs to me. And that kind of gets better. That kind of relates to the attribution that was mentioned here in the poll. The other thing is, you've told me about a problem about an asset, and that problem doesn't really exist because I've got some type of mitigating measure in place, I've got a compensating control in place, or you misdetected the issue. Those are false positives, and that's what's creating a lot of noise. And I think when you evaluate solutions, you should be looking at those elements as well, because that's what's going to make the big difference between a successful attack surface management implementation or not. That's kind of my high level view. Erik, I'd be interested to hear your view on that.
Yeah, absolutely, because I would agree, and this was my experience as a practitioner as well when I used to manage vuln and attack surface teams, that nothing destroys your credibility more on your program is when you go to those remediation stakeholders and you say, hey, this is something that you need to fix, or this is something that we picked up in one of our solutions that is a critical issue, right? And then the person that has that access, if you can find them, because finding them is also a big challenge, is illuminated in this survey as well. When they come back and say, well, this isn't even ours, or your tool has a false finding here, that it's not a critical risk, and they have the logs and so on to prove it. That's just going to destroy your credibility for when you go back to them with a real risk. It turns into a cry wolf scenario. So that's where it's really important to ensure, as you're thinking about your proactive program as a whole, from your attack surface management tools, your exposure management tools, and so on, that you're thinking about validation, that you're thinking about having some certainty when you're going to remediation stakeholders specifically on, no, we know this is a thing, and we have the evidence to show that it is an actual risk.
And Erik, I'd just add one thing there. We often tend to think about, I would say, good enough. And one of the challenges, I think, specifically with an ASM solution, which is tell me things I don't know about. That's the premise of an attack surface management or exposure management solution. An existing tool could become counterproductive, not just incrementally productive, but counterproductive, because if it's creating so much noise, it's actually wasting your resources. So it's not adding incremental stuff; it's actually hurting you, in an overall. And that's something that you don't often realize when you select a tool or when you make an evaluation.
Yeah, and I mean these tools have so many signals now, because you can get all sorts of assessments. You can get everything you buy now in your security stack has its own risk score. So how do you as a security leader go and make sense of, well, this is the risk score I should focus on? It takes contextualization and an understanding of how all these tools come together holistically in your environment, so that you can go and properly communicate this stuff. Especially you having that tribal knowledge with your organization and applying it to the specific business context. That's really what's going to win you over with your peers. It's what's going to win you over with the technical and remediation audience when you can go and talk to them about risk, right? Because an exposure or a vulnerability in isolation, just because you have a CVE on something, doesn't mean it's a risk, right? It's a threat. It's something that could become a realized risk down that chain if and when it's exploited and so on. Crown jewels are accessed, what have you. And that's why it's so important when you're talking to your peers in the C-suite, your peers in the business, or just the technical audience you need to work with, what the actual implications are, and ensuring you're not just crying wolf and and thinking the sky is falling every time an alert or some sort of weakness shows up.
That kind of segues really well. I think one of the questions that we got is, how does threat intelligence fit into this workflow? Because most of our discussion around vulnerability management, threat exposure management, attack surface management is a proactive approach. And when we talk about threat intelligence, these are findings that are after the fact. How does that tie in from a workflow perspective into the proactive security approach?
Yeah, I can answer that kind of more in a practical way on how I see teams dealing with that. So, where you see threat intelligence working with exposure management, ASM, vulnerability risk management, I'll kind of use all these kind of products, interchangeably, is threat intelligence is contextualized as an offering in a lot of these products. So it's accessible to these teams as they're going and they're looking at an exposure or a vulnerability risk. So they see, okay, my exposure management solution has let me know about a CVE, but either that exposure management solution is purchasing threat intelligence from one of the big threat intelligence providers, and they're adding it to help know, well, this is something that's being exploited in your industry. This is something that we think you should pay more attention to. Sometimes you see providers that have like their own threat research teams that'll apply their own type of threat research to these findings that are being put in literally in the UX for teams to look at. And the third thing you see BYO. So you're starting to see you can bring your own threat intelligence to some of these solutions if you're a certain threat intelligence seat holder and you want to apply that specifically to those solutions. And that's more like practically how you see that for a vulnerability risk management persona. But I want to talk quickly about that threat hunter persona, because when you think about proactive security, threat hunters also play a big role there. And where you're going to see them use it is a little bit differently. It's a little bit more ad hoc. I need to understand I need to come up with a hypothesis, with a theory about something that might be going on in our environment. And that's where they can work with someone with the CTI team, the cyber threat intelligence team. Oftentimes there's overlap, and threat hunters will have access to these feeds as well. There's some collaboration happening sometimes it's a little bit more isolated. And threat hunters will use threat intelligence, often those big long PDF reports or an ISAC RSS feed or what have you, to go and come up with a hypothesis and then validate it. So you'll kind of start with, well, this is the threat, and then you want to kind of build out what is your theory, and then you're going to hunt for it. You're going to look through your IOCs and so on based on what the threat intelligence has informed you. And I think where the question's going, right, isn't that reactive? Because we're talking about being proactive, and now we're reacting to the threat intelligence. Yes, it is. I understand the irony here, but when you think about being proactive, it's being proactive before whatever threat the CTI team or your RSS feeds are telling you, before you're proactively taking action before you have to react to that bad action, right? So I kind of get the nuance there, and I appreciate that question because of that.
Erik, I actually would beg to differ on whether it's reactive or proactive, and I think that the way we see threat intelligence, it's very much proactive, and I'll explain at least my perspective. We all know that an attacker has a journey. And the journey starts somewhere, and the journey could start with compromising someone's credentials. And of course, you want to be proactive about preventing those compromised credentials. But if those credentials have already been compromised, you want to be proactive about knowing about that so you can mitigate the use of those credentials. So there's all the question of where does the chain start and how early on in the process can you nip it. Obviously, we want no credentials falling into the wrong hands, but guess what? The reality is a little bit stronger than that. What we're seeing the demand for threat intelligence interwoven into an attack surface management solution is to make it more operational. And if you think about threat intelligence is a feed of data, and now analysts have got to sit onto it, and they've got to figure out what's relevant to me. And the attack surface management solutions essentially have built the utmost map or most accurate and comprehensive map of your attack surface. And therefore, if any piece of intel does pertain to an asset across your attack surface, we've created the strongest possible reference points, and therefore we can pin the intel on the asset. And once we've done that, now we can tell a bigger story. We can say there's a certain asset that's got a certain vulnerability, and guess what? That vulnerability is going to be compromised because someone's gained credentials to that, or someone has been talking in the deep dark web about exploiting a specific application. Guess what? That application actually belongs to you because we've identified that to you. And you may have not even known that application belongs to you. And that's how the proactive nature, or at least what we're seeing and what we're doing with customers comes into play.
Okay. So I think you got both sides of proactively reactive and reactively proactive by now. And I think there is an interplay, and the line keeps blurring. Marc, I think we'll start with you this time. How do you see red teams and penetration testing? It's definitely a proactive measure. It's adversarial type of security, but where does that fit into the mix?
So it's a good question, and I would say that our view on red teams and pen testers and attack surface management or automated systems is almost like this pyramid, in which the base of the pyramid and the biggest part of the pyramid is the automation, and that's where attack surface management, continuous threat exposure management solutions come in. It's about doing as much as possible automatically, and then as you go higher up in the pyramid and the area of that pyramid starts to narrow down, that's when you start deploying the pen testers, which are the people that look at certain areas, and then you take the red teams, which are really focused on the key main applications. That's where the risk is essentially the highest. Now, so it's almost like this hierarchy of how do you deal with the mass or the base. into the specialists where your resources become the most scarce. And at that point, the question of scope doesn't really pertain to the problem, because pen testers and red teams are operating by definition like in a certain scope. So that's kind of how we view the relationship. I think what we're starting to see is that as this entire pyramid gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, because the attack surface is growing so much, there's a limited capacity to how much humans can deal with, and the automated systems need to take a bigger part of that pyramid. And that's why the attack surface management, the exposure management, the automated pen testing solutions will start taking more of that, because humanly it's just impossible to cover so much ground.
Okay. I think one way of looking at it, and I don't know if the red teams would appreciate it, but it's kind of like doing a lot of the homework for them so they can they can work more effectively. But Erik, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that pen testers and red teamers, they are part of your proactive program, and that using solutions like these, ASM, exposure management, and so on, certainly augments their job, and it makes it a little bit easier to find some of these things that they're looking for. And where do they play as part of that proactive program? Well, Marc had a slide up earlier on assessing, validating, and prioritizing. I think that's really where they can provide the most value, because you have solutions that help do that discovery, right? You don't necessarily need pen testers or red teamers to do discovery, right? You want them to go and validate that, yes, this is a weakness, and then down the chain, as as the person in charge of a proactive program gets that report, okay, well, this is an asset that we talked about with this business area for so long, and now I have the evidence and a PDF or what have you, with screenshots and all the cool stuff that the red teamers will provide you to say, this is a priority. Look, this is something we actually need to go and handle. So yeah, it's so very valuable part of your proactive program, specifically around assessing risk, validating that it's there, and then adding to that prioritization picture when it comes to getting things fixed.
Very good. And I think we've got time for one more question.
Wow, this has gone fast.
Looking at how time flies. There is one, I think we've talked about this in multiple ways, but I understand that a lot of companies have been asking, great, we're hearing about, the broad proactive security, and we're hearing about threat exposure management now. How do we start? What are the first steps to adopting this new approach? Erik?
Yeah, that's a big question. But let me start by answering it. It's the last question, so we have time on it. Let me start by thinking about where you want your program to be when it comes to all this stuff, and to understand where your program is, and if there's deviations from it, from both a negative perspective, like we're getting worse, or a positive, like we're getting better. You need to have a baseline. So you want to understand and establish what your baseline is when it comes to your attack surface, meaning quantity of assets, how often we're discovering new assets. This type of this business area tends to go more rogue than others in deploying cloud and SaaS applications, what have you, and really looking to understand that what the expectations are, so then you can measure when there is a deviation. So as far as more practically, like, how do you get there? To kind of start forming that mindset, it's important that when you start diving in, that you start with like kind of a scientific point of view. You think, what is my hypothesis here? What do I think is happening in my organization? Maybe you have some sketchy mergers and acquisitions. Maybe you have some projects that you don't think were properly off-boarded or managed appropriately. And you can form hypotheses of maybe we still have assets from that project, or maybe this recent merger and acquisition is going to have some assets that are not up to our security standards that we want to go out there and discover. So you start with that hypothesis, and then this slide has it right here. Discover, assess what's going on, but then go back to just like we learned in high school science class. Was my hypothesis right or wrong? Where was I right and wrong? And then you can change that hypothesis and move it forward to go and continuously test. And remember, the objective here, and why I say to think scientifically about this by forming a hypothesis, it's so that you have something to test, so you have something to know how wrong or how right are we when it comes to what's out there, and how much risk is at stake here as we're going through and going through the cycle.
And I think one of the things that also came across what you just said in the examples is that hypothesis has a lot to do with business. So you gave examples like, here's a new subsidiary, a new M&A candidate, a specific, business application that we're using, but not looking at it, just from a security perspective, but tying it to the business itself. Marc, you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I think if the question that, if I understood the question that was asked, was where do I start with an exposure management, program, or how do I get on that track? I would say, and this is based on my own opinion, but also what we're seeing with with our customers, is that our exposure is huge, and it spans very, very large attack surfaces and different vectors, whether it's the external attack surface, the identities of the of employees, internal systems, etc., etc. I would always say, if you're starting with a program, make sure that it's that you can make a lot of headway quickly. It's easy. It's start with the easy to tackle. That's going to give you a big bang for your buck. And starting with the external attack surface is, at least from what we are hearing, kind of the first place to start, because that's where an attacker is going to start. Okay, they're going to start looking at you from the outside and trying to find, map you out and find their ways in. And that's the, malicious insiders and identity takeovers and whatnot. That's kind of the second phase of if someone's trying to, attack you. Not only that, 99% of attacks today are automated attacks. And therefore, what the automation's doing is looking for issues across your external attack surface. So that's definitely a good place to go. The other thing is, big organizations are fragmented, meaning there's different entities, there's different subsidiaries, there's different security operations teams. One of the great abilities of the external attack surface management solutions is the ability to kind of create this one umbrella that can encompass everything into one system very, very easily, because I don't need essentially buy-in from anyone, from multiple stakeholders within the organization. I can just go and do what an attacker essentially can do. And therefore, very, very quickly, can I get a program off the ground and running that's got a really big impact. It's easy to start, and it's impactful because, or it's commensurate to the risk, because that's where the attackers are going to start. And that's kind of what we're seeing across our customer base and different prospects that we're talking to.
All right. Thank you very much. I think our time is up. But Erik, Marc, thank you so much for sharing your views on these. And to everyone who's joined us, thank you again for joining. And we hope it was time well spent.
Ty, thanks for moderating.
Thank you.
My
Pleasure
pleasure
to be here.
All right. Bye-bye.